Okay, welcome back. So now we're moving on to chapter 5, which is just about photosynthesis. I like to link these two together because you're going to see that they're very similar. They're just going to be like opposite. And after today, you might appreciate a little bit more because our waste products, the carbon dioxide, is going to be used by plants and they convert carbon dioxide into oxygen, which remember, that's what you take in. So as we exhale, it's like the plants are inhaling that and exhaling oxygen. We're kind of like opposite, which is kind of great. So let's get a little bit into it. So as I mentioned, it's the opposite of aerobic cellular respiration. If you put the equations side by side, you'll actually see that if you just flip it, it's the same equation. It's kind of cool. So overall, what we're going to do is the plants are going to take carbon dioxide and combine it with water and use light energy. And ultimately what they do is they make sugar, which is glucose, and oxygen. Cool. All those sound familiar, right? That's why I go through a lot of time in cell respiration first. Now, this is done by plants and some bacteria, and you have to use the chloroplast to do that. Now, in order to get the gases in and out of the leaves of the plant from the atmosphere, we have these little openings called stomata, and they're like little lungs. So they'll open and close so the gases can leave and enter into the inner cells of the plant leaf. So I have a little bit of information on light, but basically light is a part of this whole electromagnetic spectrum. And there's all kinds of different ranges of frequencies of radiation that occur. But we're concerned with the visible field, which is just right here. And we're going to be talking about these little photons. They're packets of kinetic energy that we're going to harvest in the light reactions, and we're going to use that to drive what we call the dark reactions. Now, sunlight that you're used to seeing is going to consist of the ultraviolet radiation, the visible light that you're used to seeing, and also infrared radiation. You're probably used to also seeing the color spectrum, or the Roy G. Biv spectrum that goes right there. And it all has to do with wavelength, depending on where it is on the spectrum. So the further down here, the reds, the wavelength is a little bit bigger. Now, one of the key things with sunlight, when they tell you to wear your sunscreen, because the UV rays are included in sunlight. So all these photons of energy, they cause damage to DNA. So when you get a sunburn, what you're doing is you are damaging those cells, but you're also doing permanent damage to those cells because these photons that are in UV light cause damage to your DNA. If it's not fixed by your cell, then that cell becomes mutated, and that leads to cancer, which we'll talk about in the next unit. So visible light, as you're used to seeing it, depends on different wavelengths. So here's just a diagram of a wavelength. Depending how far it is between a crest and a trough, between each crest is the wavelength. Now you're used to the spectrum that you're seeing right here, so the wavelengths are going to be wider on this end compared to this end. Now this is a cool little 50-second video. It's really cool and talks about why the red wavelength is actually used for brake lights and emergency vehicles. So I call that a now you know moment. Like I said, lots of useless information, but that's really cool. Watch this, it's really cool. It's kind of cute too. All right. Now let's see. When it comes to, I got a bunch of emails all at the same time. It's all boom, 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 boom. So light can be transmitted, reflected, or absorbed. So you might see this diagram right here. Now plants, the reason they appear green is because they absorb all colors but green. And this has to do with that pigment called chlorophyll. It's going to capture light energy. There are also accessory pigments. There's keratin and all the other stuff. But if you look at this, there's chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B, and showing their rate of absorbance. And if you compare that to the spectrum here on below, so you can see that they both peak between this blue and purple light, and then between red and yellow. But both of them pretty much bottom out at green. So green light is pretty much useless to them. There's a cool video at the end about growing plants in vertical farming, and they talk about how the different colors of light they use and how that affects plant growth. It's really cool. So location, location, location. This is happening all chloroplast. So let's remind ourselves of the anatomy. You have your outer membrane and then your inner membrane. Now in the inner membrane, you also have these stacks of thylakoid. They kind of look like little coins stacked on each other. This is where we're going to have the light reactions happen. A group of them together is called the granum. Outside the thylakoids, there's going to be the stroma. This is where the dark reactions are going to happen. Now, chlorophyll, the pigment that we're talking about that makes plants show up as green, is going to be in the thylakoid membranes. They're clusters of pigments and proteins. That's where it's gathered at. So we break it up into two big parts. So we had like the three big parts for cell respiration. For photosynthesis, we're going to break it up into two. We're going to have the light-dependent reactions, and the goal of that is to produce ATP and NADPH. And then we're going to have the dark reactions, also called the Calvin cycle. And basically that's to fix the carbon that we get from the carbon dioxide and to make it into sugar. So they're going to happen, and they do feed off each other. Both cycles kind of work off each other. So the light reactions, it's going to have an input is where the water is going to go in. It's going to remove the electron, then it's released as oxygen. The electrons are going to be harvested, and then they are going to feed into the dark reactions. We're also going to pick up some ATP. We're going to recharge some dead ADP batteries right here, and we're going to use that to drive the dark reactions. The dark reactions are going to take in the carbon dioxide, put it through the cycle, and convert it into sugar. So these two do feed off each other. So you need dead ADP batteries and empty taxi cabs to be used up by the dark reactions in order for the light reactions to work. So let's go into this a little bit more detail. So this looks familiar, hopefully. If you remember the OX-phos or electron transport chain, the light reactions make a little bit more sense. So this is in those thylakoid membranes, all right? So that inner membrane stuff right there. So the first thing we need to do is we need to take some light energy, and it's going to be absorbed by chlorophyll, and it's going to excite some electrons. Now our electron donor is going to be water. It's going to lose some electrons, and then those electrons are going to go through, boom, 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 each of these different subunits, just like you saw before on the electron transport chain. Now, as those electrons go through, do you remember from the first one, what happened every time an electron went through a protein? A hydrogen ion went through. Boom, more hydrogen ions over and over again. So we keep going through this process till we get to this last protein complex. This is where we're going to get rid of the electrons that we donated from water. So the one that's going to accept the electrons in this case is going to be NADP. It's going to take the electrons that were donated, and it's going to change into NADPH. That's like an empty taxi cab. Now we're full. Now it's going to take those electrons and take it to the dark cycle. Just like before, we have that molecule ATP synthase. So all those little hydrogens that we generated from moving the electrons over and over are now going to power ATP synthase. So I hope you watched that video. And every time an electron goes through, boom, our hydrogen ion goes through, sorry, and ADP is going to be converted back to ATP. So very similar. The first thing is we got to harvest electrons, and we're going to harvest them, drive that hydrogen ion gradient, and use that to make ATP. Now we're going to take this NADPH and ATP and use that to drive the Calvin cycle. Now the Calvin cycle happens independently in the presence of light. So it can happen anytime. It can happen in daylight, it can happen at dark. It doesn't matter, it doesn't care. Now this is located in the stroma, so outside the thylakoid membranes. So what's going to happen is the CO2 molecules are going to come in, boom. What they're going to do is they're going to join a molecule, RUBP, and it's going to have the help with the enzyme Rubisco. What's going to happen is we're going to have this molecule join together. And that first step is called the carbon fixation stage. So pretty much we're taking the CO2 and adding it onto this RUBP molecule, just kind of like we added oxaloacetate to acetyl-CoA. We're going to go through the process of reduction because we need to get rid of those electrons that we harvest in the first part. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this molecule that we made in the fixation stage and reduce it to what we call phosphoglyceraldehyde, or PGAL. So pretty much the reducing part. When we do that, we take some of this. Ultimately, it winds up being, I think, a 3-carbon molecule, 6 carbon here, and it can be converted into a 3-carbon molecule. However, not all the molecules, carbons, exit here. Some of them go through the stage 3, which is regeneration of RUBP. So I know that sounds really confusing. Just remember how we had some carbons that permanently stayed in the cycle, on the TCA cycle. Same thing for the Calvin cycle. What's happening is carbon dioxide is joining in with another molecule, RUBP. It's going to go through a stage of fixation. In the process of reducing it, so we're going to get rid of some of these electrons that we picked up. We have to harvest them and pick up some, and takes energy to convert it to. We're going to convert it to this molecule, which is not shown on here, which is that PGAL. Now, some of the PGAL will exit the cycle. The rest will be regenerated and converted back, and then it just keeps repeating over and over again. So in this part, we're using up the energy we made and those electrons in order to convert carbon dioxide product with the RUBP, converting it to the sugars. So put it all together. So remember, in the light reactions, water goes in, it's the electron donor. So there's your water, there's your input right there. Oxygen leaves, that's a product. Boom. So there's how we get our oxygen that we're breathing in right now. In the process of going through that somewhat of electron transfer chain, we did generate ATP and NADPH. We picked up some electrons. Now those are going to be used as part of the Calvin cycle. So once they're used up, they go back here and get recharged again. Now the Calvin cycle, what it's going to do is take carbon dioxide. So as you're exhaling your waste product, and it's going to go through this process right here of converting that into sugar right there. So hopefully, if you took this side by side, you would see they're very similar, especially when it comes to cell respiration. So I do like this diagram because it links them side by side. So here we are with cell respiration. We went through glycolysis, the Krebs cycle. Remember the Krebs cycle, we generated a lot of CO2 that is fed into the dark reactions. And then we picked up electrons, made a lot of ATP, blah, 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 blah. And then one of the products we got is water. Now water goes into the light reactions of photosynthesis. Pick up some products right here. One of the main key things we got is oxygen. Well, oxygen is the final electron acceptor here. But look at these two equations on the bottom. Glucose and oxygen yield carbon dioxide and water for cell respiration. If for photosynthesis, carbon dioxide and water, boom, boom, right there, they're opposite. So these two processes do feed off each other. That's why plants are super important. And we have all this excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and we've been measuring levels over and over many years. And it's not just plants, there's also the phytoplankton in the oceans. There's all kinds of different ways that we have to go through and recycle this carbon dioxide and convert it back to oxygen for us to use. God, was it Fire and Ice? It's a cool documentary on HBO that kind of talked about this process. It's really cool. If I think of the exact title, I'll probably put it in a note for y'all. But hopefully after today, you might love your plants a little bit more, because we need them, because we need to take care of our carbon dioxide problem so they can make it into oxygen for us. Now, this next thing is really cool. We would have watched it in class because I think it's really awesome. It talks about vertical farming. Ladder. What vertical farming is a way to address one of our problems in agriculture. We only have so much land that we can actually use. This is a process of using it indoors and actually going vertical to harvest or to generate a lot of crops. And they also talk about how they use different colors of light to grow plants. So they're growing in red right here. So it's really cool. It's not on the test or anything, but I think it's cool, and it's, hey, you didn't know that before. And then once again, here's some review videos. Let's stop it right there.